Hello, I'm Evan with New Life for Old Bikes. Recently I did a video where we decided whether or not I should repair my aluminum Huffy ATB. It's a pretty cool bike, but we were concerned that it was valuable at all. Well, after riding it for a couple of months, I really like it. It fits me well and it shifts beautifully, and I decided maybe it's worth repairing. I'm going to tear it down and service it, and we're going to strip all the decals off and polish the aluminum frame back up to shine like new. Follow along and see how I do that. I'm not sure what year this bike is. If you have any information about it, please let me know in the comments below. The SRAM company started in 1987, and I know these are older SRAM components, so the bike could be as early as 1987. The bottom bracket is not the standard current bottom bracket that's available. It has cantilever brakes. They're not currently in use, which leads me to believe this is possibly an older bicycle. However, the head badge is a modern Huffy head badge. right. Just a quick note here. Before I started on this bike, about 2 days ago, I sprayed down every fastener with penetrating oil. Because of that, I was able to disassemble the bike in approximately an hour and a half. The other thing is, as I disassembled, all the parts were bagged and labeled. This way, later on, it will be easier to find them. One. Gee. Wow, that's tight. All right. We're going to put a 17mm wrench on each side and just back off both nuts at one time. I'm soaking my parts and cleaning them with mineral spirits. Any solvent will work, or you can simply use hot soapy water. Thoroughly clean your bearings. You want to make sure and get all the old dirt and grease out. Thoroughly inspect your bearings for any wear. If you see anything, replace them now. Use a waterproof grease. Inside each bearing is a seam. Make sure you fill that up with grease so they don't ever run dry. When tightening your bearings, make sure that they're not loose. Also make sure that they're not too tight. You don't want them to bind. Put your quick release in on the non-drive side of the bike. Make sure your tread is going the correct direction if it is a directional tread. In order to remove the freewheel from the back wheel of the bike requires a specific spline tool. This is a Shimano hub and requires a Shimano tool. I've already loosened this, but if you have a problem and don't have enough leverage, you can easily put two wrenches together and get the leverage you need to break it free. When putting the axle in, the drive side of the bike takes this big wide spacer. Again, you want your bearings snug, but not tight. And you definitely don't want them loose. That feels real good. Sometimes it takes 3 or 4 tries to get this right. This freewheel is pretty clean, but I'm taking a little mineral spirits and a brush and going over it, make sure I get all the oil and grease from the chain off of it, or at least anything that's left on there. If your freewheel has real heavy grease on it, you can take a piece of string and go in between the cogs and get the grease out that way. But again, since this one's relatively clean, I'm just going to take a piece of paper towel. I'm going to run a little penetrating oil through the freewheel. If it comes out relatively clean on the other side, I'm simply going to use a very thin oil and lubricate the bearings. Well, that's actually pretty clean. I'm running a very thin oil through the bearings on this freewheel. This happens to have paraffin in it, and it doesn't attract dirt real easily. The object here is to clean out all the penetrating oil I just ran through it. There we go. Looks pretty good. We're going to put this back on the wheel. Before installing your freewheel, wipe some waterproof grease on the threads. You don't have to worry about tightening the freewheel too much because it'll tighten itself up as you pedal. For something that started out so crusty, it's amazing what a little bit of 4/0 steel wool or 4/0 steel wool and a nylon brush to clean out the dirt will do. I think it looks pretty good. I'm going to put a coat of wax on this before installing it on the bike. This brass brush gets into spots that I can't get with the steel wool. I'll be changing the tires on this bike. It's not so much the dry rot in between the tread. That's bad, but I could easily wear that out. The problem is the dry rot on the side goes right through to the casing. Before putting the tires on, note the rotation direction. I put the logo above the valve stem so it's easier for me to see where the valve stem is. All right, that's well seated. Let's pump it up to full pressure. Tire rotation. That's correct. Okay, that's well seated. The decals on this bike are in terrible shape. They're full of chips and scratches and gouges and are coming off in little pieces. Fortunately, there were a couple of spots that came off in large sheets. I'm trying a small section of the frame rather than the whole frame with a paint stripper to see how it does. We'll be cleaning that off in about 15 minutes. I'm going to make sure that it stays nice and wet, and hopefully it'll peel all the clear coat off. Let's see how it does. Take a little bit of 2O steel wool and get the last of this off. Overall, I'm very pleased with the way the finish turned out on the head tube as well as the down tube. I took 220 grit and sanded off what was left of the clear coat, and then I wet sanded with 600, 1000, 2000, and 3000 grit to get to this point. After this, I can polish it. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and finish the sanding on the rest of the frame. The next thing I'm doing is taking a drill with a wire wheel to get the last of the clear coat out of the welds. After going over the entire bike frame with 120 grit sandpaper, I got it pretty smooth, and I'm very happy with the results. Obviously, I'll be going over it with progressively finer grits of sandpaper before I polish it. But I wanted to show you, the welds on this frame are really rough looking. I wanted to make it smooth. If I'm going through all this trouble to polish it up and make it look good, I want to make it look really good. Let me show you what I was able to accomplish and tell you how I did it. This right here is the weld with the front tube, top tube, and bottom tube meet. And I smoothed out the welds with a flap disc on my grinder. It's a 4.5 inch grinder with 150 grit sandpaper on it. And then I went back over it with 150 grit sandpaper on my little orbital sander. Needless to say, the finish turned out beautiful. Then I went ahead and hand sanded it with a little bit of emery paper. So that's what I'm going to do with some of the rest of the welds. In fact, I'm going to do that on all welds that are visible. Let me show you how it's done. I decided to work on this with relatively fine grits of sandpaper. That way I'd take off very little at a time. I didn't want to go too far on this. That'll look pretty good when it's wet sanded and polished up. I wanted to show you what the finished welds looked like after I ground them down and sanded them. I'm very pleased with the results. The next step is wet sanding the welds. I've taken a container and filled it up with some soapy water, and I'm going to use various grits of sandpaper to smooth it out. I decided to start with 400 grit. I have a lot of marks and scratches in this I want to get out, and I was concerned that the 600 grit would be able to do that. This is an update to show you where the frame is at this point. I've ground down all the highly visible welds. I went over them with a 220 grit sandpaper on a machine sander. Then I went over the whole entire frame with a 400 grit wet dry sandpaper, then 800 in spots, and then 1000 grit over the whole thing. I'm very pleased. The only thing I'm not too pleased about is I've got about 5 hours worth of time invested in it so far. After sanding this frame with 1500 grit and then 2000 grit, it looked fantastic. But it just wasn't smooth enough. So ultimately, I ended up sanding it with 3000 grit sandpaper. The results are absolutely stunning. I can't wait to polish this. It's going to look fantastic. I wanted to show you what it looked like after polishing the bottom tube. It's gorgeous. It's almost like a chrome finish. What I did, I used a little bit of mirror glaze polishing compound, and I put it on my buffer and went over the tube. I'm trying to get a mirror finish on the frame, and as such I'm going over it several times with the buffer. Put a little bit of polishing compound on it, spread it real well, and then turn on the buffer. Wow, that buffs up beautifully. The fork is the roughest part of this entire bike. As you can see, there's some pretty deep surface rust on it. Even when cleaned up, there are still some pock marks that appear. Fortunately, from the front, it looks really, really good. I'm going to go ahead and clean up this fork and clear coat it along with the rest of the bike. I think it'll look just fine. Remember, you're not going to see it any closer than probably 3 or 4 feet. The way I did this is I crumpled up some aluminum foil and I got the majority of the surface rust off. What I couldn't get off with aluminum foil, I used a brass brush because that doesn't scratch the finish. Then, unfortunately, I had to use a 2.0 grade of steel wool to get some of the surface rust off the really bad areas. This frame is absolutely stunning after the polish. I want it to stay that way, so I'm going to coat it with clear. After thoroughly cleaning the frame with the degreaser, I went over the frame with a tack rag, which is nothing more than a sticky cloth. and made sure and got all the dust particles off. At this point, I'm putting 3 coats of clear on it to protect the finish. Notice there's a pin on the back and 3 holes. Make sure whatever hole you put it on this side, you do the same thing on the other side. Make sure you use waterproof grease on all these parts. If your wheel has a quick release on it, make sure that's on the non-drive side of the bike, which is the left. As with the front, make sure that you put the pin from the back of the brake into the same hole. The further down you go, the looser it will be. The further up, the stiffer your brakes will be. One. I'm going to fill up this seam in here with grease. That way this bearing never runs dry. We've gone in front of the top cog and behind the bottom cog. At this point, make sure your shifter is in its highest gear, in this case 7th speed, and that the chain is on the smallest gear in the back. Before you tighten this up, make sure that your chain is on the smallest chain ring and that your shifter is in the lowest gear. This morning I'm at Hague Mill Lake Park to test out my Huffy ATB. I've disassembled the entire bike and serviced every component. Let's see how she does. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed my video. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Also, let me know if you think I should put the original Huffy badge back on the front of the bike. And don't forget, like and subscribe.